"Please take me with you. I can't walk anymore." The native woman begged the cowboy. Amid the howling snow, the wind howled across the wide, open plains, biting into the cowboy's skin like 1,000 sharp needles. It wasn't just a regular winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard that could strip away the will to fight and leave you lost, shivering, and alone in its endless white fury. John knew this land well, having roamed it for years. His horse, Bella, had carried him through many storms before, but this one was different. The snow seemed to fall faster than the horse could carry him, and with every gust of wind, the snow built up higher around him. The trail he had been following had vanished, lost to the storm, leaving him with nothing but the howling winds and the endless white blanket stretching out in all directions. John tugged on the reins, urging Bella forward, but even the horse seemed to struggle. Her hooves barely made a sound as they sank deeper into the snow with every step. He had been traveling for days, seeking shelter and warmth, but the storm kept him trapped in a world of white. He had no choice but to press on. Stopping wasn't an option. If he didn't find shelter soon, both he and Bella would be lost. For a brief moment, John considered turning back. The wind was cruel and the cold was unbearable, but there was something driving him, something he couldn't explain. It was a mixture of duty and the pull of the unknown, a sense of something bigger than himself guiding him forward. His fingers were numb, barely able to grip the reins, but he refused to let go. He had to keep going. Bella's breath came out in visible puffs, and John had to steady himself, shifting in the saddle, trying to keep his balance as the horse slid over the icy ground. Then, through the white haze of the storm, John caught sight of something, a dark figure lying in the snow. At first he thought it was just a trick of the wind, the swirling snow playing tricks on his eyes. But as they drew closer, he realized it wasn't a trick at all. There, in the middle of the storm, was a woman. She was lying on the ground, her body barely moving, her skin pale against the snow. John's heart skipped a beat and his mind raced. Who was she? How had she ended up here? What was she doing in the middle of a blizzard all alone? His instincts kicked in. He immediately tugged on the reins and steered Bella toward the woman. As he dismounted, his feet sank into the snow, but he didn't care. Every second mattered. The woman's eyes fluttered open as John knelt beside her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her face was a pale shade of blue and her lips trembled. She looked up at him with confusion, fear, and a faint trace of hope. John could see that she was in pain, barely able to lift her head to meet his gaze. He didn't waste any time. Without thinking, he scooped her into his arms and carefully lifted her from the ground, feeling the weight of her frailty. She barely weighed anything at all, her body a collection of bones and ice-cold skin. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. "You're safe now," John said, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him over the roar of the wind. He looked around, hoping to see some sign of shelter, but there was nothing but the endless white of the storm. The woman's eyes closed again and she let out a low, almost inaudible moan. Her body trembled uncontrollably. She was clearly in shock, and it was clear to John that time was running out. If he didn't get her to safety soon, she wouldn't survive this. John lifted her onto Bella's back with careful hands, making sure she was securely positioned. His heart raced as he climbed back onto the horse. There was no time to waste. The storm was relentless, and they had to move fast. Bella seemed to sense the urgency in the air. She took the first few steps cautiously, but as soon as she felt John's command, the horse quickened her pace. They moved through the storm, the sound of Bella's hooves muffled by the thick snow, the howling wind drowning out everything else. As they moved, John kept his eyes on the woman, trying to steady her with one arm while holding onto the reins with the other. He could feel her shivering against him, her body trembling from the cold, but he had no choice but to press on. There was no shelter in sight, no sign of life, just the overwhelming white of the storm and the constant pressure of time. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. John wasn't sure how long they had been riding, but he could feel his strength beginning to fade. The wind burned his face, and his fingers had gone numb, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on the reins. But he couldn't afford to stop. The woman needed him, and Bella's steady pace was the only thing keeping them moving forward. "Please hold on," John muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the woman or to himself. They had to survive this storm. He had to find a way to keep going. The snow was beginning to fall heavier, and John's vision blurred as the flakes piled up in front of him. He felt himself growing tired, his mind growing foggy. But then, just as hope seemed to fade, he saw something in the distance. A small shadow just beyond the horizon, barely visible through the storm. His heart leaped in his chest, and he urged Bella forward with renewed determination. It was a sign of hope, a small cabin or a shack, anything that could offer them shelter. They pushed through the storm, and as the shadow grew clearer, John saw it. A small cabin standing alone against the backdrop of the storm. It was small and humble, but it was shelter, and it was close. With every ounce of strength left in his body, John guided Bella toward the cabin. He didn't know who lived there, but he didn't care. They had to get inside, or else they wouldn't survive the night. John was breathing heavily now, his body exhausted, but he focused all of his remaining energy on getting the woman to safety. As Bella reached the small cabin, John dismounted and lifted the woman from the horse. His body ached, but there was no time for that. The woman's life depended on him. He pounded on the door of the cabin, his breath coming in ragged gasps. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with a long, grizzled beard. He stared at John and the woman in shock, but without a word, he stepped aside and let them in. John didn't wait for an invitation. He carried the woman inside, collapsing onto the floor with her. The man quickly went to work, building a fire and offering John a blanket. But John's thoughts were on the woman, and he knew he couldn't stop now. "Please, stay with me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure if the woman could hear him, but he wasn't going to leave her side. As the storm raged outside, John watched over her, hoping and praying that they would make it through the night. The warmth of the fire in the small cabin felt like a miracle. The crackling flames fought back against the freezing cold that had clung to John's bones ever since the storm began. But even though the fire offered some comfort, it couldn't erase the exhaustion he felt. His hands were still numb, his body ached from the cold and the long ride through the storm. But there was no time to rest. The woman, Yana, needed him. He watched her closely as she lay on the small cot by the fire. Her face was pale, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Her lips were cracked, and her skin was rough from the biting cold. John could feel the weight of her fragile body in his mind, and a sense of urgency settled over him. He had saved her from the storm, but now the battle wasn't over. She was still fighting for her life. John moved closer to her, sitting beside the cot and watching her closely. He could feel the heat of the fire on his back, but it didn't seem to touch Ayanna. Her body shivered uncontrollably, even though the room was warm. The blanket she was wrapped in didn't seem to help. She was still cold to the touch, and that terrified John. He knew that if she didn't warm up soon, the damage from the frostbite could be permanent. With a sigh, John stood and walked over to the small table where the old man had left a kettle of hot water. He poured it into a cup, then brought it to Ayanna's side. He gently tilted the cup to her lips, helping her sip the warm liquid. Her eyes fluttered open at the touch of the cup, but she didn't seem to have the strength to move on her own. "Drink," John urged softly. "It'll help you." Ayanna's eyes focused on him for a moment, and she gave a faint, tired smile. She tried to take the cup from his hand, but her fingers were weak and unsteady. She had no strength left, not after the cold had drained everything from her. John held the cup steady, letting her sip as best as she could. "Thank you," she whispered in a hoarse voice. Her words were barely a whisper, but John heard them clearly. He nodded, unsure of what to say. Words didn't seem to matter. The only thing that mattered was getting her through this, getting her strong enough to survive the storm. The blizzard was still raging outside, and John knew they couldn't stay here forever. If Ayanna didn't recover soon, they wouldn't be able to leave the cabin and the storm would trap them. John sat down beside her, his eyes never leaving her face. She looked so fragile, so lost. Her dark hair was tangled and her skin had taken on an unnatural shade. He didn't know much about her, but he knew enough to understand the danger she was in. He had to help her. He wasn't sure how he would, but he couldn't just sit and wait. Ayanna closed her eyes again, and John took that moment to look around the cabin. The walls were rough-hewn wood, the floor covered in layers of old, woven rugs. There was a small table near the fire, and a few chairs were scattered around the room. Everything in the cabin was simple, but it was warm. The old man had done what he could to make it comfortable, but it was clear that they were alone here. There were no other signs of life, no signs of anyone else who had survived the storm. John sighed. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. As much as he wanted to stay close to Ayanna to make sure she was safe, he knew that the storm wouldn't last forever. Once it passed, he would have to move on, and so would she. But for now, the most important thing was to keep her alive. The old man had given him blankets, but they didn't seem to be enough. Ayanna still shivered, and John could see how pale her skin had become. The cold had done a number on her, and even the fire didn't seem to help. It was as though the chill had seeped into her very bones, and no amount of warmth could chase it away. After some time, the old man returned to the cabin. His face was lined with age, his hair a tangled mess of gray. He looked at Ayanna with concern, then turned to John. "She's not the first one to be caught in the storm," the old man said, his voice gravelly. "This blizzard has been coming for days. There's no telling how many others have been trapped out there." John nodded grimly. He had suspected as much. The storm was powerful, merciless. And it didn't care who it left behind. "We can't just sit here," John said, his voice tight with worry. "She won't survive if she stays like this." The old man looked at Ayanna, his eyes softening. "She's lucky you found her," he said quietly. "But luck only takes you so far. You need to get her warm or she won't make it through the night." John clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice low. The old man paused for a moment, his eyes shifting between John and Ayanna. Then he sighed, a deep, resigned sound. "We'll need to get her out of those wet clothes," he said. "We can't let her stay in them or she'll freeze to death, and we need to wrap her up in something warmer, keep her close to the fire." John hesitated. He knew it was the only option, but the thought of removing her clothes made him uncomfortable. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know her past, and she didn't know his. But in that moment, all that mattered was saving her life. He gently helped Ayanna sit up, supporting her as the old man retrieved a thick, woolen blanket from a chest in the corner. John helped her out of the soaked clothing, wrapping her in the warmth of the blanket. Her skin was so cold to the touch, but her eyes remained open, locked on him as though trying to hold onto some shred of awareness. As John settled her back into the cot, he noticed how weak she seemed, how fragile. She had no strength left to fight. The storm had taken so much from her, and he couldn't let it take her life too. She closed her eyes again, the weight of sleep pulling her down, but John didn't dare let his guard down. Not yet. For the next few hours, he kept vigil by her side, making sure she stayed warm and that her breathing remained steady. The fire crackled in the background, offering what little comfort it could, but John knew that Ayanna's survival was far from guaranteed. The storm might have stopped, but it had left a deep mark on her. He had to keep her alive, had to keep her safe, no matter what. The storm outside had died down, but the stillness inside the cabin felt heavy. John sat close to the fire, his thoughts racing as he watched Ayanna. Her breath was deeper now, steadier than before, but her eyes remained closed, her face pale and fragile. It had been hours since the old man had left, and John was left alone with Ayanna. He couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. She had made it through the worst of the storm, but the road to recovery would be long. The cold had ravaged her body, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to bring her back to full health. But what choice did he have? He couldn't leave her here to die. He had made a promise to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to break it. As the hours passed, Ayanna began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused for a moment, her gaze flickering around the cabin before it landed on John. He had been sitting there watching over her, never taking his eyes off her face. He hadn't slept, not even for a minute. He couldn't, he needed to make sure she was going to be okay. "Where am I?" Ayanna's voice was soft, almost too weak to be heard. She shifted beneath the blankets, but her body seemed reluctant to move. "You're safe," John said, his voice low and steady. He smiled at her, though it was more of a reassurance to himself than to her. "You're in a cabin, the storm. It's over now." Ayanna blinked a few times as though trying to process what he was saying. She didn't speak for a long time, her eyes drifting to the fire, the warmth seeming to soothe her. She was silent, and for a moment John wasn't sure if she was still aware of him. But then, as though the words had been building inside her, she whispered, "Why? Why did you help me?" John was taken aback by the question. It was the first time she had spoken since he found her in the snow, and the weight of her words hung in the air. Why had he helped her? The answer seemed so simple, he couldn't just leave her to die. But when he thought about it, it went deeper than that. There was something about Ayanna, something about the way she had looked at him in that moment of desperation, that pulled at him. He had never been the kind of man to let someone suffer, but this was different. Ayanna wasn't just another stranger in need of help. There was a connection between them that John couldn't explain. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I guess I couldn't just leave you out there. No one should have to face that kind of cold, alone." Ayanna's eyes softened, and for a brief moment a quiet understanding passed between them. She didn't say anything else, but John could see the gratitude in her gaze. It wasn't just the kind of gratitude that came from being saved. It was something deeper, something that made him feel like he had done more than just help her survive. As the days went on, Ayanna's condition slowly improved. The old man returned each day with supplies, food, water, blankets, and helped tend to her wounds. John did what he could, but it was clear that Ayanna needed more than just physical care. She needed someone to be there for her, someone who would listen, someone who could make her feel safe again. The conversations between them were sparse at first. Ayanna was still weak, and talking seemed to take more energy than she had. But John would sit beside her, watching over her as she slept, offering words of encouragement when she woke. They were both quiet, but there was something comfortable in their silence, something unspoken that drew them together. In the stillness of the cabin, they found a strange kind of peace, even though the world outside was still harsh and cold. One evening, as the sun began to set and the fire burned low, Ayanna turned her head to face John. She looked at him for a long time, as though studying him, trying to understand him. Then, almost as though the words had been sitting on the tip of her tongue for days, she finally spoke. "Where are you from?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Why are you here?" John looked at her, surprised by the question. He hadn't really expected to talk about himself. He had been so focused on keeping her alive that he hadn't thought much about his own story. But now, with her eyes on him, waiting for an answer, he realized that he wanted to share it. He wanted her to understand. "I'm from the South," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've been traveling for a long time, just moving from place to place. I don't really have a home anymore. I've been on my own for years." Ayanna didn't say anything at first. She just listened, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and something else, something deeper. It wasn't pity, but understanding. She had a story of her own, and John could tell that she was waiting for him to continue, waiting to see if he trusted her enough to share more. "I'm not like other men," John went on, his gaze distant as he stared into the fire. "I never wanted to settle down, never wanted to stay in one place. I just wanted to keep moving, until I came across you." Iana didn't interrupt. She simply nodded as if processing the weight of his words. "I don't know why I stopped that day," John said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe I was tired. Maybe I just couldn't leave you out there, but I couldn't leave you to die. Not like that. No one deserves that." Iana studied him for a moment longer before her lips curved into a faint smile. "You're not like the others, are you?" John looked at her, surprised by the question. "No," he said softly, "I'm not." The conversation drifted into silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a mutual understanding between them now, a bond that neither of them could explain but both could feel. They were two strangers brought together by fate, their paths crossing at a moment when the world seemed to be against them. But somehow, in this small cabin, they had found something that felt like more than just survival. It felt like connection. As the days turned into weeks, John and Iana grew closer. The bond between them deepened, a quiet companionship that neither of them had expected. Iana began to open up more, telling John stories of her people, her life before the storm. She spoke of her tribe, of the land she called home, and of the people she had lost. John listened with empathy, feeling a sense of sorrow for the struggles she had endured. Through their shared stories, they began to understand each other more deeply. The more they spoke, the more they realized how much they had in common. They were both searching for something they hadn't yet found. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite so alone. The days seemed to blur together in the small cabin. The storm outside had passed, but the cold still held its grip on the land. Iana's condition had improved, but she wasn't yet strong enough to travel. Her body was still fragile, her muscles sore from the frostbite and the long hours spent in the snow. John had kept her company, staying by her side, helping her regain her strength day by day. But as much as he wanted to stay, he knew they couldn't remain in the cabin forever. The storm had passed, but their journey was far from over. John had come to care for Iana in a way he hadn't expected. He had saved her from the storm, but in a way, she had saved him too. The loneliness that had followed him for years, the emptiness he had always carried, seemed to lessen when she was around. She had become his reason to keep going, and he couldn't ignore the bond that had formed between them. But now, the time had come for them to leave the cabin and continue on. Iana knew it as well as he did. She could feel it in the air, the quiet tension that had settled between them in the past few days. The storm had kept them trapped, but now the world was open again, and they had to move forward. She had come to trust John, more than she had trusted anyone in a long time, but the thought of leaving the safety of the cabin made her uneasy. She had spent so many days recovering, and her body still felt weak. The fear of the unknown gripped her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face the world again. John noticed the change in her. She had been quieter than usual, her eyes drifting to the door as though she was preparing for something she couldn't control. He could see the fear in her face, and he knew she wasn't ready. He wasn't sure if he was either, but the longer they stayed here, the harder it would be to leave. "Iana," John said gently, his voice soft, "we can't stay here forever. We need to keep moving." Iana didn't look at him right away. She stared at the fire, her eyes lost in the flickering flames. She had come to depend on this small, safe space, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin. She had grown attached to the quiet rhythm of their days together, the simplicity of their life in this place. But she knew John was right. She had no choice but to face the world outside. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but I'm not sure I'm ready." John moved to her side, sitting down beside her. "You don't have to be. We'll take it one step at a time, just like we've been doing. We'll move slow and we'll make sure you're strong enough before we go any further." Iana looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his expression, the quiet determination in his eyes. He wasn't just trying to push her out the door. He was trying to help her, trying to make sure she was ready to face whatever came next. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to go back out there. What if we don't make it?" John reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, steady, and comforting. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. "I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll make it together." For the first time in days, Iana smiled, though it was faint. She knew John wasn't lying. He had kept his promise to help her survive, and she had come to trust him with her life. But the fear still lingered in her heart. She had lost so much already: her people, her home, her sense of security. The thought of losing even more was terrifying. John could see the fear in her eyes, and he understood. He wasn't ready either. The world outside was dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But it was also the world they lived in, and it was the world they had to face together. "We'll take it slow," John repeated, his voice low and firm. "I'll help you get stronger, and when you're ready we'll go, but only when you're ready." Iana nodded, a small sigh escaping her lips. She wasn't sure she could ever be ready, but she knew she couldn't stay here forever. They had to move on. And John was right. She wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were spent preparing for the journey ahead. John gathered what little supplies they had left, food, water, and blankets, and packed them onto Bella, the horse that had carried them through the storm. Iana helped as best as she could, though her body still felt weak and unsteady. She could feel the weight of the journey ahead pressing on her chest, but she was determined to keep going. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. On the morning they finally left the cabin, the sun was bright in the sky, but the chill of the air reminded them that winter was far from over. The wind had died down, but the cold still bit at their skin, making every step feel like a challenge. Iana was bundled up in every blanket they had, her face partially hidden beneath the layers. John, though wrapped in his own coat, still felt the sting of the cold, but he didn't show it. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. Before they left, the old man who had taken them in came to the door to see them off. His face was grim, but there was something softer in his eyes when he looked at Iana. "Take care of her," the old man said, his voice gruff but kind. "The world outside is cold, and not just because of the weather. But if you've made it this far, you've got a good chance. Look after each other." John nodded, a silent promise passing between them. He had already promised to keep Iana safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. As they rode out of the cabin's small clearing and into the snow-covered landscape, Iana glanced back, the cabin growing smaller in the distance. She didn't look back again. There was nothing left for her there. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Iana knew one thing for sure: she wasn't facing it alone. John was by her side, and for the first time in a long while she felt a spark of hope. Together, they would make it through whatever came next. The road ahead seemed endless. The snow-covered landscape stretched out in all directions, the world silent except for the soft crunch of their footsteps and the occasional whinny of Bella. The wind had picked up again, but it wasn't as fierce as it had been during the storm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but the cold was still biting. They had been traveling for days now, the journey proving harder than either of them had expected. Iana's strength had improved somewhat, but she still wasn't fully recovered. Her body, though more stable, was still weak from the frostbite and exhaustion. The long ride had drained her, and every step felt like a struggle, but she wasn't complaining. She couldn't afford to. There were too many unknowns, and she had already come too far to turn back now. John kept a steady pace, always watching over her. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her movements had slowed. He had hoped that by now they would have found a safer place. some sign of civilization where they could rest. But so far, all they had found was open land and the cold, lonely emptiness of the wilderness. "Let's rest here," John said one evening, pointing to a small patch of trees just off the path. He could tell Ayanna was struggling, and though he hated to stop, he knew they both needed it. She nodded, grateful for the chance to sit and rest. As they made camp, John worked quickly, setting up a small fire to ward off the cold. The flames flickered, casting a warm glow on the surrounding trees. Bella, the horse, grazed nearby, and Ayanna sat down on a log, her back stiff from the long ride. "Are you okay?" John asked softly, sitting beside her. His voice was gentle, the concern in his eyes unmistakable. Ayanna nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was really okay. "I'll be fine," she said quietly, looking away. "I've just never traveled this far before." John watched her closely, knowing that there was more to her words than she was letting on. He had seen the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes had a distant look in them. The weight of her past was heavy, and even though she had started to open up to him, he could see that some things were still too painful to speak about. "I know it's hard," he said after a pause, "but we're almost there. Just a little longer and we'll find shelter." Ayanna looked up at him, her eyes dark with unshed emotion. "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "What if we never find it? What if we're just wandering forever?" John didn't answer right away. He hadn't realized just how much doubt had settled in Ayanna's heart. She had come so far, and yet the road ahead still seemed uncertain. He could feel her fear, her uncertainty, and he didn't know how to reassure her. But he knew one thing for sure. "I'll get you there," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I made a promise to you, Ayanna. I'm not going to break it." For a moment, Ayanna said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. The fire crackled between them, the heat from the flames doing little to soothe the cold inside her. She had been through so much already, lost so much, and yet she was still here, still fighting. "I don't want to be a burden," she said finally, her voice small. "You've already done so much for me. I don't know if I can keep going." John's heart tightened. He had never seen Ayanna like this, vulnerable and uncertain. It was as if all the walls she had built around herself had crumbled, and he was seeing the real her for the first time. "You're not a burden," he said gently. "You never were." Ayanna turned her head to look at him, her gaze intense. "But you've done so much already. You've saved my life." John shook his head, cutting her off. "I'm just doing what anyone would do. No one should be left to die alone in the snow. I couldn't leave you out there, and I won't leave you now. We're in this together." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise. Ayanna didn't know how she had ended up with someone like John, someone who would stay by her side even when the world around them was falling apart. She had always been taught that survival was a lonely thing, that the world didn't care about anyone but itself. But John had proven her wrong. In the middle of the cold, the snow, and the endless uncertainty, he had shown her what it meant to trust someone. The next morning, the sun rose high in the sky, the light bright and promising. They packed up their camp, the warmth of the fire still lingering in their bones. John had insisted that Ayanna ride Bella for a while, giving her body a rest from the exhausting trek. She didn't argue. It felt good to be off her feet, even if only for a short time. As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change. The flat, barren land was replaced by rolling hills, and in the distance, Ayanna could see the outline of a small town. Her heart fluttered with a mix of hope and fear. The town meant safety, but it also meant leaving behind the only thing she had known for so long, the wilderness. The place that had once felt like home was no longer where she belonged. She had changed, and now she had to face what that meant. "We're almost there," John said, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. Ayanna nodded, her chest tight. She didn't know what she would find in the town. Would she be welcomed? Would they accept her? She had been away for so long and so much had changed. She wasn't sure if she even knew who she was anymore. But then she looked at John, and the worry in her heart eased a little. No matter what happened, she knew she wouldn't be alone. She had come so far, and they had made it through so much together. Whatever came next, they would face it together. When they finally reached the town, the first thing they noticed was the people, their faces, their voices. There was a sense of normalcy here, something that had been missing from their lives for so long. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was a place where they could finally rest. As they entered the town, Ayanna could feel the weight of her journey lifting from her shoulders. She was tired, she was scarred, but she was alive, and that was something worth fighting for. John looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "We made it," he said softly, "just like I promised." Ayanna smiled, the first real smile she had smiled in days. She hadn't realized just how much she needed this, how much she needed to believe that the world still had something good to offer. "We made it," she agreed. And for the first time in a long time, Ayanna felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She had survived the storm. She had survived the cold. And now she had the chance to start over, to build something new. With John by her side, she felt like anything was possible.